There are moments in life when even the most composed, most patient, most carefully trained individuals reach a breaking point. For Princess Catherine, Princess of Wales, that moment arrived not on a public stage, not during a diplomatic crisis, nor amid the relentless scrutiny of the global press. It arrived quietly, in a corridor of one of England's most storied estates, when she saw something no mother should ever have to witness, her child being made to feel small by someone who was supposed to love her. Catherine had spent over a decade learning the unspoken language of royal life. She understood that within those ancient walls, silence was often more powerful than speech. She had mastered the art of the composed smile, the gracious nod, the measured pause before responding to something that might otherwise have ignited her. She had absorbed criticism, navigated palace politics, and endured the kind of scrutiny that would have broken most people without ever once losing her composure publicly. But composure, she had always understood, was not the same as indifference. And when it came to her children, Catherine's patience had limits that no title, no tradition, and no amount of royal protocol could move. The gathering had been planned well in advance, as all royal engagements were. A private family luncheon at Windsor, arranged in honor of one of Queen Camilla's charitable patronages. It was the kind of event that appeared effortless from the outside but required considerable invisible labor from everyone involved. The children were dressed carefully, briefed on behavior, and expected to represent themselves with grace. Charlotte, just 9 years old, had done everything right. She had greeted the adults politely, sat where she was told, and engaged the other children warmly. Catherine had watched her daughter that morning with quiet pride. Charlotte was bright, spirited, and naturally confident in a way that sometimes surprised even those closest to her. She had her mother's poise and her father's ease with people, and she wore both without arrogance. She was, by any measure, a remarkable child. Which is why what happened that afternoon struck Catherine with such force. It began subtly, the way most wounds do. Charlotte had been in the side salon with the younger royal cousins, playing a casual guessing game, the kind of innocent competition that children fall into naturally. She had known the answer to a question, and said so, cheerfully and without any intention of showing anyone up. But Camilla, who had been passing through, had paused at that moment. And the remark she made, delivered with a patient smile and a tilted head, had cut through the room like a blade wrapped in silk. She told Charlotte she was showing off. She told her not to speak unless spoken to. No one raised their voice. No one made a scene. And that was precisely the problem. When Catherine found Charlotte alone in the corridor 20 minutes later, standing with her hands clasped and her eyes fixed on the floor, she didn't need an explanation. She had seen that posture before, on herself, in the early years, when she was still learning what she was and was not allowed to be in this family. She had promised herself that her children would never know that particular kind of silence, the enforced kind, the kind that comes not from peace but from suppression. She crouched down to Charlotte's level and asked her gently what had happened. Charlotte hesitated, as children do when they are unsure whether their pain will be believed. Then she told her. Granny Camilla had said she was showing off. She had been told to be quiet. She had only been playing. Catherine pulled her daughter into an embrace and held her there. On the outside, she was steady. Inside, something had shifted permanently. A single incident can be explained away. A misunderstanding, a bad day, a moment of thoughtlessness. These things happen even among people with the best intentions. Catherine understood this, and so she observed. She watched carefully during the remainder of that afternoon, filing every moment away with the same disciplined attention she had always applied to the demands of royal life. What she noticed over the following hours was not dramatic. It was quiet, consistent, and deliberate. A glance when Charlotte reached for a second scone. A comment about portions wrapped in a half-smile and addressed to no one in particular. A correction disguised as concern. These were not the actions of someone having an off day. They were the actions of someone who had developed a habit, and habits, Catherine knew, did not form overnight. By the time the family regrouped inside after the garden walk, Catherine had seen enough. She was not an impulsive person. She did not react to things before she had thought them through completely. But she had now thought this through, had turned it over from every angle, and had arrived at a conclusion she could no longer push aside. This was not accidental. Charlotte was being targeted, not with cruelty perhaps, but with something almost more dangerous. The kind of quiet diminishment that a child internalizes not as an attack but as a truth about themselves. That evening, once the children were settled and William had finished his calls, Catherine sat across from her husband and told him everything. Not with tears, not with trembling, but with the clear, organized precision of a woman who had spent years learning how to communicate within a system that did not always reward directness. She told him what Charlotte had said in the corridor. She told him what she had seen at the refreshment table. She told him about the pattern, about how it was not just one comment but several, each one alone dismissible, but together forming something impossible to ignore. William listened without interrupting. When she finished, his expression had settled into something quiet and resolved. He did not minimize what she described. He simply agreed that it could not continue. The following week, Catherine kept Charlotte home from a charity garden event that Camilla had organized for the royal grandchildren. She gave a polite excuse, a minor cold, something unremarkable, but the decision behind it was anything but casual. She was not willing to send her daughter into a space where she had reason to believe Charlotte would once again leave feeling less than she arrived. The well-being of her child was not a political calculation. It was the only calculation that mattered. Word of Charlotte's absence reached Camilla, as news within royal households always does. The response was a quiet remark, offhand and dismissive, suggesting that Charlotte was perhaps too fragile for a bit of outdoor work. Catherine learned about it through the network of household staff and aides who move silently between the worlds of these great families. She stored the remark. She did not react to it. But she did not forget it either. The private dinner at Highgrove was intended to be a reset. Charles had arranged it with his characteristic optimism, hoping that the intimacy of a small family gathering might ease whatever tension had settled between the two women. Charlotte had come only to say good night to her grandfather before being taken upstairs, a brief appearance, warm and simple. But when Charlotte walked into the main lounge and offered her polite evening greeting, the response she received was not warmth. It was a remark about whether she was too tired to be present at all. The question was framed lightly, as though concern for a child's rest schedule, but its effect was unmistakable. Charlotte's smile faltered. And Catherine, standing just a few steps behind her daughter, felt every protective instinct she possessed converge at once. She did not raise her voice. She did not allow the moment to become a spectacle. She simply turned to Charlotte, gave her a small nod, and guided her toward her grandfather for their good-night embrace. The family nanny took her upstairs. The door clicked shut. In the silence that followed, Camilla made one more remark, casual and half-addressed to the room, suggesting that Charlotte was very sensitive. It was the kind of comment designed to reframe a child's emotional response as a personal deficiency. And Catherine had heard enough. She stepped forward. Every word she said was chosen carefully, delivered calmly, but with a force that owed nothing to volume and everything to conviction. She told the room that Charlotte was not too sensitive. She was a child. She deserved to be spoken to with kindness. She had done nothing wrong. She had been polite, she had been gracious, and she had been made to feel inadequate for no reason other than the fact that she existed in a space where someone had decided to find fault with her. Camilla attempted to deflect. She offered the explanation that she had only been surprised by the late hour. Catherine acknowledged none of it. She stated clearly that this was not the first incident, that she had observed a pattern, and that she was not willing to continue acting as though the pattern did not exist. The room grew very still. Charles tried gently to redirect the conversation. Catherine would not be redirected. Not this time. She was careful not to shout, not to assign motives she could not prove, and not to escalate beyond what the situation required. But she was equally careful to leave no ambiguity about where she stood. Her daughter would be spoken to with respect. That was not negotiable. It was not subject to institutional considerations or diplomatic compromise. It was simply the standard, and it would be met. William, who had remained quiet throughout, finally spoke. He aligned himself completely with his wife. He asked for basic respect, nothing more, nothing less. Camilla set down her glass. She said nothing further in defense of herself. And though no apology came that evening, something had shifted in the architecture of the room. A thing that had been unspoken for too long had finally been said aloud, and there was no taking it back. Later that night, Catherine sat beside Charlotte's bed in the quiet of Adelaide Cottage. She didn't ask questions or invite Charlotte to relive the evening. She simply held her hand. She told her daughter that she had done nothing wrong, that she had been exactly who she was supposed to be, and that being herself was always enough. She told her that she would never need to shrink herself to fit into any room, regardless of whose room it was. Charlotte looked up at her mother with the kind of trust that can only exist between a child and the adult they believe most completely in the world. And Catherine felt the full weight of that trust, not as a burden, but as a responsibility she had never taken lightly and never would. In the days that followed, things were different. Not dramatically, not with any outward declaration, but in the subtle way that true shifts always manifest. Charlotte's school recital at Lambrook was attended only by immediate family. The invitation list was quiet and intentional. When the photographs from the event were released, they showed what they were supposed to show, a family celebrating a child. What they did not show was who had not been included, and why. At subsequent royal events, Camilla maintained her distance from Charlotte. The casual remarks ceased. The small corrections, the pointed glances, the half-smiles that communicated more than words, these retreated. And Charlotte began to breathe more easily again. When the family gathered at Balmoral for the summer, Catherine arrived with her children and her boundaries firmly in place. She had agreed to come because tradition mattered, because Charles genuinely cherished the time with his grandchildren, and because withdrawal was not the same as protection. But she had been clear with William before they arrived. She would not leave Charlotte unsupervised with Camilla. Not after everything that had happened. The first few days unfolded gently. Charlotte relaxed visibly, chasing her brothers through the fields, helping with baking in the kitchen, returning to the lively, curious version of herself that Catherine had worried she was beginning to lose. It was a relief to witness. It felt like something recovered. Then came the afternoon when Catherine, briefly distracted in conversation with a guest, was told by a household aide that Charlotte was in the sunroom with the Queen Consort. She excused herself without explanation and walked quickly through the corridor. As she approached the sunroom, she heard voices. Camilla was speaking to Charlotte, her tone measured and instructive, telling the child that it was important to listen rather than speak, and adding, with careful casualness, that Charlotte's mother sometimes forgot this lesson too. Catherine opened the door. Charlotte looked up and crossed the room immediately to stand at her mother's side. Catherine observed this without comment. The message in it was everything she needed. She told Camilla, calmly and without any theater, that she had heard the conversation. Camilla began to explain, but Catherine did not require an explanation. She told her that Charlotte was a child, and that children should not be corrected for simply speaking. She told her that Charlotte was growing up just fine, and that she would continue to do so without being made to feel like a problem. She asked for kindness. She stated that this should not be too much to ask. There was no argument. Camilla's silence was not agreement, but it was not defiance either. It was the silence of someone who has run out of ground to stand on. Catherine held her daughter's hand and walked out of the room. There are things that royal training cannot override. It can shape behavior, constrain expression, and impose patience beyond what most humans are capable of. But it cannot override a mother's instinct. It cannot override the fierce and absolute love that Catherine carried for her children, a love that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the most fundamental human commitment that exists. She had not gone looking for a battle. She had spent years choosing grace over grievance, patience over confrontation. But she had also spent years watching, learning, and waiting for the moment when silence itself would become a form of harm. That moment had come. And when it did, Catherine met it with everything she had. Not fury, not theatrics, not the kind of scene that ends up photographed and published and analyzed. She met it with the quiet, unshakable authority of a woman who knew exactly what she was fighting for and refused to apologize for fighting. Charlotte would grow up knowing that her voice mattered. She would grow up in the knowledge that someone in her corner was always paying attention, always watching, and always willing to step forward when it counted. And perhaps that, more than any title or tradition or royal obligation, was the truest inheritance Catherine could offer her daughter. Not perfection, not silence, just the certainty of being loved completely, and the courage to know that love sometimes means standing up, quietly, firmly, and without ever backing down.